Welcome to our third session of Navigating Your Finances God's Way, which you will know is the importance of being free to serve Him. So, a reminder, we've already done the first two studies on Blueprint. We're now going to look at being free to serve Him. And then in our next module, we're going to be looking at generosity. And in our final module, we're going to be looking at saving and investing. Now, just come and have a little look with me for a minute. You're hopefully filling in and putting lots of notes in your Navigating Your Finances God's Way. This is your book. You can scroll on it, you can make notes, and remember, no one will ever see it, because if you were ever to lose it, there's a little note at the front of the book that says, "This is mine, don't go any further." I hope you've all bought because you remember Korean in Joburg. And it's a book that you could sow out and invest in others who perhaps haven't been on the course. But what I'd also like to do, and I don't know if your group have actually invested in buying any of these books for the group, but you can if you like, and if you have children or grandchildren. And we have two books that have been developed and designed. This is for children who are 7 and under, and it's called Give, Save, Spend. And on the inside, it's all wonderfully colourful. And there are 12 chapters. In chapter 1, learning what God says about money. The chapter's called The Wish. The next chapter is called Who Owns the Ball? And that's about God owns it all. Chapter 3, Noah Cares for the Animals. That's about being faithful stewards. And so this is just a wonderful book. It was originally written by Howard and Bev Dayton, and we modernized it and updated it, and my designer created some wonderful pictures. And sometimes adults buy these books and they contact us and say, "I've learned so much about what the Bible says just by reading this book." And do you know what? Train up a child in the ways of the Lord. The world is ready to teach you and your children about how to handle money. We're going to take a stand and we're going to do things God's way. And then there's some things to do, some coins to play around with, and there's Who Owns the Ball. So that's for the 7 and unders. Now, for the 8 to 12-year-olds, we have The Secret. And this is a story about 4 children who are going to be going on an adventure holiday, and they're saving up the money for the adventure holiday, and then suddenly they find there's a real pressing need in the church about somebody who needs to raise some money for an operation. And guess what? They give the money away. And you have to read the story to find out how it wonderfully ends. But again, it's just written for the older ones, so they're going to be reading this themselves. And anyhow, the books are available on our website if the leadership doesn't have them, or maybe having sort of heard my little advert, you might like to sort of buy a few books. But you know what? It's about blessing the younger generation. Do you know what? The younger generation are going to have far more challenges than you and I have had. They'll just be able to take their card and suddenly the money's gone. Gone are the days when it's all about cash, and then we have to put our card in. We can now sort of do cashless transactions. And I want to encourage you, invest in your children, because what we don't want to do is to have our children having financial challenges. They're already possibly facing the challenge of debt into higher education. They're already facing the challenge of, how are we ever going to buy a house? I just want to take this one area and say, do you know, remember 2,300 verses, 16 out of 38 parables. This is such an important part of our daily lives, and I hope, and this is a blessing to you, and you'd like me to get on with the course. So welcome back. We know which way we're going. We're going to be looking this time on page 33. So I'm just going to find page 33. So I'm ready with you. Free to serve. But last time, what did we do? Remember? We talked in module 2. If you missed the last course, we talked about living in the circle, having a clear boundary, and having a clear financial plan. We talked about being financially free. And then we talked in the practical session about doing a little budget, getting it up to date, and then living according to the plan. It's a bit like if you were to go on a journey from where you live to I don't know, to London, and you're not sure how to get to London, and you put it into the sat-nav and you follow the path. And that's just like your spending plan. You know, this is not a one-off plan, it's a living plan. And it's there to help keep you on the rails. You know, when we go on the train to London, the train keeps on those two rails. And that's what the plan does, to keep you on track and give you a little bit of flexibility with your impulse spending and what have you, and make sure that you build a saving in, and that we're going to do in our 5th session. So anyhow, scripture memory verse. Now, at the end of our last session, I cheated a little bit. So it isn't quite as simple as the borrower is slave to the lender, but it's not a lot more complicated. And you'll have seen it. It's Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. Remember I talked about having an open hand and having a plan, an intentional plan. In that budget, can you put something in there for giving to the poor? You know, Jesus said, the poor will always be with you. Remember, there are 300 verses in the Bible that talk about the importance of being generous to the poor. Remember, there are people on this earth in countries like Africa who do not yet have pure, clean water. There are people in this world who go to bed every day hungry. There are people dying from starvation. Surely in this rich world in which we live, surrounded by a world of plenty, we could find something for others. And you know, we haven't even started to talk about generosity. Here's what I want to say to you. Because, you know, we can focus on debt. And you might say to me, so I've got to get out of debt before I start to give, before I save. No. We're going to look at the importance of actually getting out of debt, the importance of giving, and the importance of saving together. It is possible, and it's God's way, and we're going to be looking at it. You know, I want to say this to you. We're never more like Jesus than when we're giving. But this is about debt, so forgive me for my enthusiasm. I mean, make sure you come to the next study. Make sure that you bring somebody else, because we're going to be really looking at some exciting verses and times together. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. Consider that you have learnt that verse, having heard me say it twice. In fact, all of you now might like to say it with me. Are you ready? It goes like this. Ready? The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. Now you can all do better than that. So one more time. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. I promise not to do that with you again. Module 3, our overview. 3 parts. First 2 parts are spiritual. What is on God's heart, and what are the pitfalls with regard to debt? When it comes to borrowing, what are our conditions, what are our boundaries, and how we can get free from the burden of debt? And then we're going to look at some practical stuff. So first of all, let me have a look at a few statistics with you. Now, the danger of recording this and putting it on the web is that probably the day that I recorded this, the figures were probably out of date. They certainly will be now. So please understand that these are ballpark figures. They might have changed, but probably only a little. Savings. 30% of people in the United Kingdom have no saving, while 68% have less than 10,000. Insolvencies. Now, I put this statistic on the screen about 3 or 4 years ago when I was doing some seminars in churches, and it was 90,000. When I checked 4 years later, it was 91,500 a year. So I think 90,000 thereabouts. But you know what? These are numbers. It's not. No, it's families. It's households. It's husbands and wives. It's children. It's distress. It's despair. It's a threat to the relationship. That's how significant an insolvency is. So let's do everything we can to manage our finances so that we move away from the despair of an insolvency. Personal debt. This statistic comes from the Money Charity. The insolvency one comes from the United Kingdom government's insolvency service. You might like to register for the Money Charity's newsletter, a great newsletter. They have a monthly newsletter which, for those of you that love numbers, there's just loads of numbers. I've just chosen one. The average consumer debt is £7,500 in this country. In fact, if only the minimum balance was paid on that £7,500, it would take over 25 years to repay. Oh, I am going to show you something about debt that will absolutely amaze you. And if there's anybody listening that's an accountant, oh boy, it will amaze you too. How do I know that? I lecture accountants regularly, and occasionally I ask them the question that I'm going to be talking to you about in a few minutes, and they are staggered at the answers they get. So those are a few statistics. If you have got time and the inclination, I'm going to introduce you to a website that has got so many changing figures. It is just unbelievable. It's called the US Debt Clock, and you just sit and watch it, and there's like 60 numbers that are going up and up and up and up and up. And it's all about the debt that is forever increasing, debt that has to be eventually repaid by our children and our children's children. In the USA between 1910 and 2017, just have a look on the screen at how much the United States debt was increasing per every citizen in their country. And then just look globally and you'll see that at the debt table, and you can extract the up-to-date figures because I know it won't be January 2018 that you're looking at this. I mean, it could be January 2025. I don't know. No, I should probably have redone this by then. No, I should have got somebody younger to do it. But anyway, I just want to say this to you. There's something missing off the bottom of the table. Just look at the staggering amount of debt the United Kingdom, Japan, France, Italy, Germany, USA. Oh, let's go to the other end of the table. Let's find out which countries have the lowest debt. Interesting, isn't it? Look at the staggeringly low debt of Russia and China. Let's look at some more statistics. These come from the Institute of International Finance. I promise you, for those of you that don't like numbers, there's a few more numbers coming up, but I'll try and make it interesting. Anyway, you can look on the screen there at the amount of debt. Do I understand those numbers? No, but I know they're big. I know they're huge, and I know they're all about sort of debt and production, and I can see that, you know, debt is just, remember mammon? Anyhow, I just want to ask you this question. How did all this debt really arise? When did it start to escalate? So I want to give you a story. Here is Frank. His name is Frank McNamara. And on the 8th of November, 1949, Frank wanted to go to lunch, and he wanted to go with his colleague. His colleague was Alfred McNamara. No, sorry, Frank McNamara went to lunch with Alfred Bloomingdale. Yes, the grandson of the founder of that famous New York store, Bloomingdale's. And they were sort of in a company, and they wanted to go and discuss the problem with a particular debt that had arisen. So these two worked in the Empire State Building in New York. They went for lunch, had a wonderful lunch, no doubt, probably burgers and fries. No, I'm joking. No, I'm not. They probably had burgers and fries. And then at the end of lunch, oh no, heavens above, they said, we've got no cash in our pockets. Ladies, does that sound like a man? Maybe. What are we going to do? So Frank said, we've got no money, we can't pay. So Frank went over to the wall. This is what they did in those days. Phones were on the wall. Yeah, I know. This is like before mobile. So Frank got on the phone and phoned up Mrs. McNamara, and probably the conversation went something like this. Sweetie, yes, you know, that's what men are like when they, you know that help, something's being asked for. We've got a problem. Alfred and I are having lunch. Oh, this is a true story, by the way. Well, the conversation might not be exactly true, but it is a true story. We're having lunch, we've got no money. Darling, will you come and pay? The phone was slammed down. Eventually, Frank's wife turns up, pays the bill, and Frank leaves the restaurant to go back to the office. And he said, never, ever again will that happen to me. And so in February 1950, just 3 short months later, Frank went to lunch at the same restaurant, only this time he paid with a card. There were already store cards in America, but they were just cards for individual stores. This was a pan store card. It could be used across a number of different stores and establishments in New York. And he paid for his lunch with this card. Do you know what the card was called? Well, there's the card on the screen. It was called, as it is today, the Diners card, the Diners Club card. And in those days, back in 1950, you had to pay the balance at the end of the month within 7 days. It took the banking industry 10 years before they learnt the trick of rolling over interest on the card. So we're now from 1950 to 1960. Now, in 1966, can you all remember what happened? Now, some of you are saying England won the World Cup. Well, yes, that's true. But it is also the year that Barclays Bank did a deal with the Bank of America for a card that they called the Barclay card. And yes, that was the very beginning in 1966 of credit cards in the United Kingdom. And so what I'd like to do is I want to show you how, if I can use the word without offending everybody, how wicked the card system is. So if you could just follow me with some numbers, and I want you to imagine, let's take the people on the right of the room, and I want you to imagine that you are all saving £1,000 a year for 40 years. So at the end of 40 years, you've saved £40,000, and there may have been a little bit of interest added. So you on the right of the room, you've got £40,000 plus a little bit of interest. Now, on the other side of the room, you have all got credit card debt of £5,555. Now, interestingly, at 18%, which is approximately the average interest rate on a credit card, your interest each year is £1,000. And for 40 years, I want you to imagine that you never pay off anything other than the 18% interest. So over 40 years, on the left-hand side of the room, you will have given the credit card company £40,000. Interest of £1,000 a year. Over 40 years is 40,000. So over to the right-hand side, remember, on the right-hand side, you've saved 40,000. And on the left-hand side, you've given the credit card company £40,000 in interest. With me. Oh, I'm not going to go there, but if you had a store card, the figures would still be the same, except the interest would be a lot higher. So let's not go there. So here's what I want to ask you. At 2%, those of you who have saved £40,000 would have interest and capital of £61,200. In other words, £40,000 of your money plus £21,200 interest. So, right of the room, your interest is £21,200. Here's my question. For those of you on the left of the room, how much interest have the credit card company made out of the £40,000? Remember, on the right-hand side of the room, your £40,000 at 2% has given you 21,200. On the left-hand side of the room, the credit card company have £40,000 in interest. They are earning 18% on that money. That's 9 times more than the 2% for those of you on the right-hand side of the room. 9 times more interest rate, 18%. How much interest have the credit card company made? Anyone care to shout out a few numbers? Now, I can't hear what you're saying, but £100,000? No. £250,000? No. Do I hear £500,000? Oh, that's the number some accountants have given me. So if you're an accountant and you said 500,000, that's what accountants tell me. No. £1 million? No. Are the credit card company making £1.5 million interest on the same 40,000? I'm not going to go any further. The credit card company make £4.5 million because the compound effect of 18%. No wonder credit card companies make so much money. No wonder they want you to transfer the balances free. Oh, incidentally, transfer your balances free. And because the moment you make one more payment, they will be charging you interest at 18%. And it might be years before you've paid off that transferred balance at 0%. Staggering, isn't it? That is the great credit card system, and that's what I call wicked. You're in the grip of the credit card companies, and I would encourage you to do everything you can to recognize that this is the usury, to use a very biblical word, rate of interest. And if you were at 25% in the store card, it wouldn't be 4.5 million, it would be 33 million. If you are left-brained, an accountant, if you're interested, go check it out on a calculator. Put in the figures, £83.33 a month, and you'll see these results. 83.33 is £1,000 a year monthly. So let's have a look at some tricks of the world. Buy this because you've deserved it. Now, you've heard me say that before. But transfer your credit card and enjoy 0% interest. Enjoy 0% interest? Well, maybe, but what about the rest of the charges? Well, buy now because you deserve it. Oh, can you ever find those 40% discounts? It's like the prices from. It's only going to cost you £40 per month. I travel a lot to South Africa, and I teach in churches in South Africa as well as accounting conferences. And I never see the cost of any car on those billboards. It's always so much per month. No one ever sort of says, it's going to cost you 36 months, 40. The psychology is you can afford it because it's only so much per month. Or buy now and pay in 2020 or 2021. Prices from. Cards make buying your goods easier. You have been selected. 4 for the price of 3. Do you remember Iceland started the whole bog off, buy one, get one free? I mean, I was in a shop somewhere where it was buy 20, get 22. And I'm thinking, well, why not buy 200, get 230? Where it's just crazy, isn't it? They want to upsell us all the time. I go on a certain airline and buy a cup of coffee. And it's an airline that sort of goes around the UK, and they've got blue livery, and anyhow, I'm not going to tell you which company it is because I'm sure you've worked it out. And I buy a cup of coffee. Would you like a chocolate bar? Would you like a sandwich? I think, do you know what? All I want is a coffee, please. And then I find out reading the papers one day that the staff are all getting commission on these things. And I think, do you know, buy one, get one free. So why do people get into debt? Do you know, there's a range of circumstances, sometimes unavoidable circumstances through no fault of their own. I can remember one lady whose husband left her. She was a lady with 6 children, and her husband disappeared. He'd got debt with her name on it, which she'd signed, and all sorts of complications. So sometimes the circumstances for debt are unavoidable. That's just the way that it is. Ignorance. Do you know, the world does not want us to be savvy when it comes to debt. They just want us to respond to our desires of the adverts and the inner sense of I must have this. That's what those adverts are for. There's some wonderful, talented, creative people in marketing, and they succeed because they're getting us to buy things. Or maybe we're just being indulgent. Do you know what it is to perhaps go on holiday with a budget? And do we ever keep to those budgets now because suddenly we're relaxed? Or maybe there's some impatience. You know, you wouldn't dream of spending 18 months saving up for a coffee machine. Or maybe it's just poor planning. Or maybe you've got your own specific circumstances. It's a little bit like, you know, those of us who get a little bit overweight. I did not plan to get, you know, a stone or 2 overweight. I am planning to, this year, lose a little bit of weight. And, you know, sometimes we don't keep to the plans. Many do not plan to get into debt. But the thing is this, is that many now do not plan to get out of debt. There's just an acceptance. There's a sense that it's just too big a problem for me to face. With your faith, it is not too difficult. With God, all things are possible. So let's just ask the question, what does the Bible say about debt? I'd like you to know there are a number of references to debt in the Bible. Every single reference in the Bible to debt is always in the negative. It always talks about getting out of debt. So what does the Bible say? Well, let's have a look at what Paul wrote in the Romans. Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. It's very difficult to love somebody who owes you money. You know, I've often sort of said that, you know, if you're going to lend money personally to somebody, lend it on the basis that you don't expect to get it back. Just lend it freely, so that if they don't repay you back, you don't stop loving them. And the answer to the question is, what does debt have to do with love? It's just that it puts a barrier from loving one another. You've heard this verse before, Proverbs 22 verse 7. The borrower is, what an image of the word slave. I spent many years living in Bristol, which was where many thousands of slaves from the West Indies came through. So in the city that I live in, we know from our history what it was for people to be brought in as slaves. And at the beginning of 2018, I saw a news report that talked about how girls from Vietnam have been brought into this country as slaves to work in some nail bars. And it's just a dreadful situation to be in, and yet the Bible contrasts debt with slavery. What does Peter say? Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Wow. There we have an encouragement to live and to serve God. Incidentally, and at the time of recording this program, I can't remember exactly what's coming up towards the end of this session. But I do know that Paul talks about the fact that he talks about, and you will know which verse it is, I hope, or your leader will find it. It talks about not making men slaves. And that's what debt does when you're in debt to credit card companies. And you know, you shouldn't be in condemnation if you're in debt. But what I want you to do is to feel strong and to sense that the people around you if you need help. A wise man seeks much counsel. I'd always encourage you to start with church leaders or someone that you have a good relationship with, that you trust, who's got a good known track record for being a good advisor. So in the Old Testament, what do we learn? Because remember, 2 Timothy 3:16, we said we were going to look across all the 66 books. The alien who lives among you will rise above you higher and higher, but you will sink lower and lower. He will lend to you, but you will not lend to him. He will be the head, but you will just be the tail, and he will be in control of it. Debt often arose in the Old Testament as a result of disobedience. Incidentally, the chapter that we're in, chapter 28 in Deuteronomy, is replete with advice and counsel about finances and debt. And you can read on the screen. And what I'm going to do, I just wonder if somebody in the group would like to read that verse out. And I'll just take a break. I hope I've got my timing right, or maybe your leader put me on pause. Debt always presumes on the future. I'm going to turn with you to page 37. But the future is always uncertain. At the turn of 2018, and if you can take your minds back, but there was the tragic accident when 5 people were in a plane and crashed into a river in Sydney, Australia. There was a businessman who was a widower, and his fiancée and her daughter, and they were just killed. They were planning to go to the England-Australia Test match in Sydney. I've known people go out to work in the morning on a motorcycle and be killed. I've known people go to work on a motorcycle and have an accident that meant they could no longer go to work. And do you know, you'll know people. Debt presumes on the future. And what does James say? James, remember, was the half-brother of Jesus. And James said this, "Now listen, you who say, tomorrow, today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city. Spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? Gosh, you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast and brag. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins." Gosh, I just want to encourage you from the point of view of minimizing debt and not increasing debt is, first of all, listen to Paul when he talked about be content. Resist the temptations that the world will put in front of you every single day. I was looking at, I was scanning through the channels recently, and I found a channel, and it was exactly the same advert as I'd seen in the middle of a film. There are so many adverts with such wonderfully smiling people looking so happy because they've been given £50 or £10 to go and gamble for free. You know, those government health warnings about smoking cigarettes, which now have resulted in cigarette packets having sort of massive wording about the damages. But when it comes to gambling, they don't have any warnings on those screens. When you invest in stocks and shares, they're required to say your investments may go up or down. But when somebody gambles, somebody wins, but a lot of people lose. Anyhow, it's about being filled with the Word of God, being content, and resisting the ways of this world. So there is no condemnation if you are in debt today. But what I want you to do, together with the people around you, or if you're on your own, is to know that there is a way forward. Somebody sort of said to me, how do we get out of debt? And when we get on to the practical session, we'll give you some ideas on that. Debt can be a hindrance to God providing. Isaiah wrote this, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." Could God provide? If we wait on Him, when we get into debt, we're denying the opportunity for God to work. I knew somebody who was believing it was right to go and buy a car, and somebody in the church after 3 months gave them a car. I know somebody who had a washing machine break down, and they had 3 children, and somebody else in the church came and repaired the washing machine. And I'm sure you know stories of how if we wait on the Lord, rather than rushing into the world and trusting, God will always turn up, even if it is at the last moment. So could God provide in another way if you're short of money to purchase something? Back into the Old Testament again. The wicked borrow and do not repay, but the righteous give generously. How much more blessed it is to be giving than to be in debt. Is there a difference? The question on the screen, and you might like in the Let's Talk session discuss this. Is there a difference between debt and borrowing? I think we get into debt when we have sort of short-term debts. Payable if you're in business, you pay your debts every month. And incidentally, if you're in business, then paying people promptly is a great testimony to people who you do business with. But when we borrow, we sort of borrow for the long term. Is it debt? Yes, but borrowing is sort of something that we have to give back over a period of time, having incurred a rate of interest. You may have somebody who's got a different point of view, and the wonderful thing about this course is that we wish to embrace everybody's point of view as long as it's rooted back in the Bible. You have some people in your group who I'm sure have got deeper insight than perhaps I have, and it's a joy to be able to ask people to share in the Let's Talk session so that we get not just one person's view on what the Bible says, but many people. Remember I said to you the Bible says that it's important that a wise person takes much counsel, and this is an important area. You and I both know this. We are committed. That's why these films are available on our website for free. We've invested in creating the slides. We've created in the multimedia team that we've worked with. People have given generously so that we can share the truths and get this message out about what the Bible says about handling money, possessions, and giving. This is an important area. Back into Proverbs 22. Do not be a man who strikes hands in pledge or puts up security for debts. If you lack the means to pay, your very bed will be snatched from under you. I think probably this is one of those verses that has people coming up to me and says, I just did not know. What this verse simply says is basically, do not put up as your name as a security. In America, the only place which I know has statistics for, 70% of people who give security are called upon to pay the debt. The only reason why people are called upon to give security is because they don't think that the individual has got the wherewithal to pay. There is one exception in the United Kingdom. There is one exception, and it is simply this, is that when your son or daughter first goes to university, I think all universities require the parents to secure the rent debt for at least the first year. To which I say it is mandatory, and actually you've just spent 18 years paying for the livelihood and bringing up your son or your daughter, and I just think, you know, that's the right thing to do. It is kith and kin. But I'd like you to weigh that carefully. I indeed know many people who've come up to me and said, you know, I'm not going to do it, or I've done it and I wished I hadn't. I did it and I can't get out of it. And so just take on board what the Bible says. Remember, Proverbs is a book of principles. Infringe these biblical principles at your risk. Don't jeopardize the family. For many, many years, I was an accountant with a business giving advice to business people in Bristol. And I would routinely help my clients to get debt. And it was very normal to sign the house over. But you know, it's not a house, it's a home. And the Bible says this, Paul writes in Timothy writes, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Don't jeopardize your family by signing the house over, because especially if you're going into business for the first time, who knows how successful the business will be. If you've been in business before, what I would say to you is do everything you can to not put the family home at risk. If there's one thing that I understand from my own home and marriage, my wife wanted to know that the mortgage was paid and that there was money for food. A lot of other things we could do without. When we first started off, I was getting a very small salary training to be an accountant, and there was a time when there was no food in the cupboard, and we had an Indian gentleman living next door, and I don't think anybody knew that we were not very well off. And the Indian gentleman one day said to my wife, come here, and he had a huge bag of vegetables and food in which he gave to her, and she went back into the home and cried. And God knows our needs, and we need to make sure that we don't jeopardize the family home or our ability to meet the needs of our family. In the Gospel of Luke, we read this, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. You are not defined by your car. You're not defined by your technology. You're not defined by your holidays and the exotic places some people go while other people can't afford to go anywhere. What are our motives? If we live life for God, then we will love others. If we love others and we love God, we will share. So that's our first part. We're now going to go on to our second part, and we're going to look at boundaries, and we're going to be looking at released from the burden. So let's look at borrowing. Going back to our first session, we talked about mammon, and so you will know that we teach that debt is an important tool in Mammon's toolkit. It enjoys putting a banana skin on our path in an attempt to trip us up and make us fall over and put us in bondage. So when is debt permissible? That's an interesting question, but not one we can answer from the Bible, because nowhere in the Bible does it state when you can incur debt. Remember I said to you at the beginning that you are not obligated to believe anything I say or anything I teach when expressing my views, but you are obligated to believe what the Bible says. So what we're going to share is the view of the Compass ministry over a long period of time. Your group leader may have got something to share. You might have something to share. So these are our views, that it is okay to incur debt in order to acquire an asset that increases in value. And here's what I would say from my experience, and that is this, is that I believe that you should never put your finances under pressure to the extent that if interest rates increase by 2%, that you would not be able to pay the mortgage. You see, the thing is that in 2007 and in years before, when interest rates spiraled, we ended up with people in what we call negative equity. And the fact is that if interest rates went up by 2 to 3%, we may end up in that situation again, where house prices fall because people can't afford to make the payments. You see, people since 2007, when interest rates fell, have enjoyed much lower mortgage payments than those of us who were perhaps having mortgages in the 80s and 90s and the noughties. And so it is good to be prudent. It's also good to have what I call margin. What margin do you have? If interest rates went up and your mortgage was to increase by X, would you be able to afford it? So that's the first situation. The second situation is investing in education. You see, if you were to invest in training to be an engineer, or training to be a doctor, or even training to be a pilot, where the training costs for a pilot are somewhere in the region of £100,000. But with all of those, there's the expectation that you'll be able to enjoy a level of income from that education. So as such, it's an investment in what you're able to do for the rest of your working life. And the third example, having taken good, solid, professional and good counseling advice, is investing in your own business. So those are the three areas which, as I said to you, I think that we recognize that there's nothing in the Bible. I would say that I think this is a very Western view. You go into countries in Africa and countries such as India, and where they're living on less than $2 a day. And this would just really not apply. So I think we must recognize that it is something where you must pray, seek advice, and be wise in the decisions that you take. I used to have a lot of people come into my office, and often it would be the man who would be driving the business and making the investment, and then saying to the wife, sign here. Remember, I said to you that a house is not a house, it's a home. And so I just think that getting into long-term or structured debt, if I can call it that, is something that we need to be very careful about. So here are some parameters and principles which you can again think through. Can you borrow free of interest? It's important, because it's biblical, not to charge interest to a fellow believer. The Bible talks about not paying usury rates of interest. And again, this is actually my view, because we must answer the question, what is a usury rate of interest? And my answer, because of my experience, is that when I would arrange finance with banks, it would be often something like 3 or 4% over the standard base rate. So by definition, what I would say is that something in that region, I would say, is a normal and fair rate of interest, but I would not regard the credit cards as people who are charging a fair rate of interest. And the other thing I'd say to you is just look very carefully at some of the adverts that you see on television. Oh, they are so well made, and yet they are obliged to tell you the APR. What on earth is the APR? Well, not everybody is aware that some companies are charging interest rates of well over 1,000%. And the APR stands for the annual percentage rate. And they make it sound so attractive, and they make it sound so easy, and they make giving you the money sound so instant. But it is a trap that goes way beyond the slippery banana. And you need to take great care. Great care. I have seen people borrow money at these rates of interest, and it has almost ended them. I've seen people borrow money, get into debt, and in Bristol we have the Clifton Suspension Bridge, and I won't go any further, but people have ended their lives. Vehicle financing, let's just talk about that for a minute. Most cars these days have a life of way over the 3 or 4 years for a finance agreement. So here's what I'm going to say to you. Here's how to end finance lending for cars. Be content. Do not seek to get the new model at the end of the 3 years. At the end of the contract for your finance payments, keep on making those finance payments, but put them into a savings account. And then maybe for 2 years, keep saving those interest repayments, maybe for 2.5 years. And then at the end of the 2.5 years, you have got an investment in a savings account because those payments were continuing. You have the second-hand value of your car. You now have a budget for your next car. And it may be you've got a little bit left over. But it's about saying, I will not incur car debt. I will be content, and I will take a step towards becoming debt-free in this area. Oh, another example, moving house. In the 70s and 80s, people were borrowing a lot of money, and every time they moved, they either increased the number of years and or increased the mortgage. So here's the challenge I would have for you. Is it possible that when you move house, whatever the loan is, and it could well be, I know that it will be more, if your mortgage has got 17 years left, rather than go from 17 back to 20 or 25, could you renegotiate and have a loan that's repayable over 15 years? In other words, work towards becoming debt-free and avoid the problem that so many people who are retiring today have, that they've topped up their mortgage and they're going into retirement owing money on their house. So there are a few ideas. This is another great discussion group point. I've just given you a few ideas. Not everybody will necessarily agree with me, but I think there's some sound principles there that will just give you some parameters that you can think through. So back to the Bible. Proverbs 21 says this: the plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage, but those who are hasty surely to poverty. And so, you know, I'm not asking you to wait 18 months for the coffee machine, but you know, it was about the discipline. It was about not responding to the fact that I love coffee. Anybody who knows me will know that I always have my meetings wherever I can in a coffee shop. And I love my coffee. So that coffee machine was important to me, but I wasn't allowing my inner desire for a great coffee machine to rule my financial decision. And after 18 months, I figured out that nobody in my family was going to give me a coffee machine, so I thought, right, I can't wait any longer. But are you with me? You know, we can make a joke about it, but it's such a serious subject. And you're doing battle the whole time with the world. But the great news is that we are victors, and you can be an overcomer, can't you? Or you might be listening to this and you might not be in debt. You might have been in debt and you've worked your way through. There are others who need your wisdom, others who need your experience, others who need your encouragement. There are agencies who have advisors who can help people in debt. I quoted some statistics from the Money Charity. There's also Christians Against Poverty, people who are such a great help in the marketplace, helping people to get out of debt. So borrowing, you know, some simple basic questions without getting back into too much of being an accountant. Is the return from the loan greater than the cost? Is there a value in the investment that you're making? Will the value of what you've bought increase over time, or will it depreciate? And be very, very careful. It's a very strong word at the beginning of the last line there. But be very careful not to borrow for consumptive purposes. Save is the word that I would ask you to think through. And defer. You remember delayed gratification? And remember I said to you that these sessions were about giving you the pieces of the jigsaw and lifting up a picture of how we can better manage our finances. Yesterday has gone. Whatever failures you might feel, can I just say that God does not see you as a failure? So why should you see yourself differently from how your Heavenly Father sees you? When borrowing, do you have the peace that passeth all understanding? Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to be peaceful and to be thankful. I always believe that one test is that we are peaceful at what we're doing. Then on page 39, what are your goals for your giving? What are your goals for achieving what you want to achieve? Is there really no other way than incurring debt? Can you handle it? Paul's letter to the church in Corinth said everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible for me, but I will not be mastered. I will not be controlled. I will not be dominated. So our psychology, our inner peace is really important. A couple of desired outcomes. We want the least possible limitations, and we want to give ourselves margin. So the 2% on the mortgage rate, can you repay it if the mortgage rate goes up? When you move house, can you reduce the amount of money? They're just all simple principles to help you, give you some railway lines to help when you're thinking and you come across this in the future, to think back to what it is you learnt on navigating your finances God's way. So let's go into 1 Kings chapter 4. We have a film. It's quite an amazing film. The film was made by Crown Financial Ministries, and it was commissioned in particular by Chuck Bentley, who at the time of the recording was still the CEO of Crown Financial Ministries. You can read the story in 1 Kings chapter 4 verses 1 to 7. I think this is one of the most amazing films that I've seen. I think it was the first film that was made about the widow and her oil. I just would say this to you, and I say this to everybody who I show the film to. Just watch the widow when she pays the debt back. Just watch her eyes. I think it's the most captivating moment in this film. Anyhow, without more ado, I would like you to watch the film made by Crown Financial Ministries called The Widow and Her Oil.
We have come to collect your husband's debt. We have waited long enough. Woman! Answer me! We have come for your husband's debt. Pay it. All of it.
My husband is dead, and I have nothing. What are you doing? Please.
How old are you?
No.
13.
They will do well in my fields. Both of them. 3 days. If you do not pay all of it, I'll take both your sons. I'll be back soon.
Elisha!
Hello.
Your servant, my husband, is dead. You know he feared the Lord, and that he was known among the prophets. Now, his creditors, they want to come and take my children as his slaves.
What do you have?
What?
What do you have in your house?
I have nothing.
What do you have?
Nothing. Except a little oil.
Bring it to me. Go to your neighbors and get all their empty jars. And get as many as you can carry. And bring it here. Pour the oil into the empty jars. When each is filled, put it to the side. Get all you can carry.
I need another jar. Hurry. Hurry, I need another jar.
the jar. But there are no more.
Elisha, we did as you said, and...
Go sell your oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons live on the rest.
Thank you. Thank you.
Such an amazing film. Do you know, we don't know why the widow's husband was in debt. But what we do know is that her first reaction was to call out to the Lord. She went to the prophet to seek advice. And what did the prophet say? He said to her, "What do you have?" And he had to ask the question 3 times. What do you have? I have nothing. What do you have? And she turned around and she said, I have a little oil. And then he said to the lady, he says, go and get some jars. You see, because the jars were the capacity that were going to be filled. And then he said to her, go and get the jars in the neighborhood. So she went out into the marketplace to go and gather all the jars from friends and people that she knew. And then when the oil started flowing, you saw how it kept flowing and flowing and flowing. And then when she had her full jars, she went back to the prophet, and he said, go into the marketplace and sell. So you know, it was at that time that the prophet was saying, be a businesswoman, go and sell what you have. And then when she collected the money in, he said, go repay your debts. And there was that look on the 2 men's faces when they knew that they weren't going to get her 2 sons. And she looked at them as she put the money in her hand. You see, what the prophet was saying to the lady is, what do you have? Whereas so often in the Western world today, it is, what can you get? And so I'd encourage all of you who think that you don't have any talent, don't have any abilities, and that you feel hopeless, look back at the widow in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 to 7, and draw strength from her situation. She trusted God, she sought counsel, and she followed through on the advice of the council. Well, after that film and that short summary, it's now time to get talking again. And so I'd like you to get into your groups, and your group leader may well have different questions. I'll leave you to decide what you're going to discuss, but I do look forward to seeing you back when we're going to get into some practical steps on borrowing. I'll see you very shortly. Well, after that little chat amongst the group, we're just going to finish off this last session by giving you 6 simple key steps to get out of debt. Seeking God's supernatural help. First of all, if you're in debt, go pray. And just say, ask for forgiveness, ask for help, and just ask the Lord to help on the journey through your debt freedom journey. Use what you already have. Borrow wisely. Close the circle. Trust God and listen from within, or live from within God's provision. A few thoughts. I think it's been a long session, but I look forward to seeing you in the practical session, which is coming up next. Well, welcome back to our final session. It's the practical bit. This is the bit that you can do on your own, not in the group. It's private, it's confidential. So here we go with part 3 on the application. You'll see on your screen, those are the 8 steps that we're going to walk through getting out of debt. And you'll notice the first one that we've got is the spiritual one. Pray at the beginning, and I could put a 9th, which says pray all the way through. So pray. So what do we read in Paul's letter to the church at Philippi? He says this: do not be anxious. This is a command, right? Please do not be anxious about anything. Put your anxieties away. Put your worries away. Overcome mammon. You remember the first effect of mammon was to create anxiety or worry? People don't worry if you're getting into debt. They just think about the money they're making. They don't think about the personal consequences. Do not be anxious about anything. But and I love some of the words. It doesn't say some things. It says in everything. So if you have a lawyer in your group, he will help you define what everything is. It means everything. By prayer and by petition, being thankful, present your requests to God. So what do you pray about? Well, first thing is transfer ownership. Secondly, confess and repent. Thirdly, promise God that you're going to do things different, be obedient and ask for help. Just a few practical steps under the heading of praying. Secondly, I want you to enter into no new debts. If you have a real problem with a credit card, the first thing you could do is plastic surgery. Plastic surgery means you get the pair of scissors and you get the card and you cut all the way through it. Next, use cards. I have had cards in my wallet for the last 20 years. I don't have a single credit card. I have a debit card which goes straight to my current account, and I have a monthly card which you might call, everybody calls it a credit card, and I guess it is, but it automatically gets paid off at the end of every month. I have not paid a penny in interest for 20 years on my cards. So use cash. Use the envelope system that we talked about earlier. And the other thing is never use consolidation loans. Oh, here's my question. And I know that you're going to be silent on me, and I can hear the silence, okay? How do you spell consolidation? How do you spell consolidation? That's it. C-O-N. It's a con. You see, what they do is they take all of your loan payments, some of which may have penalty charges, and they'll stretch the payment out and consolidate it into one payment. So you end up with less payments going out per month, but more interest. Oh, and the other thing is this, is that again, these are American statistics, but I have checked them with 2 or 3 CAP people that I know, that's Christians Against Poverty, and they've said it's not dissimilar in this country. In America, 65% of people who take out a consolidation loan take out more debt in the following 18 months and end up in greater debt than before. So that's the temptation, and as Christians we need to recognize that we should be paying our debts off as early as possible. So you'll see some practical steps. First of all, If you look in your manual, we ask you to list out all your debts, creditors, amounts that you owe, the amount you owe, the monthly payments, so you can see the headings there. And then what we want you to do is to create a budget so that you are spending less than what you earn. And what I want you to try and do is to, and if you Google and perhaps look through, there are something called a snowball debt repayment calculator. And what I want you to try and do is create a budget and somehow find a little bit of extra cash for repaying the debts. Now, there are different ways of downsizing debt, but what we do is we try and find another sort of 30, 40 pounds, or maybe a little bit more. And if you walk through the manual, we talk about how to use the snowball method in step 5, and we give you an example in the manual. And it basically says, pay off your smallest debt first, and put that little bit extra onto paying off that small debt. And then when that small debt is paid off, take the money that you were paying to that small creditor and roll it, hence the word snowball, onto the next payment. You see, when you are paying off, and in the example you see it on your screen and in the manual, I think there's sort of there's 5 creditors. That first of all, when you've paid off the smallest debt, you can celebrate. And maybe when that debt's paid off, you can have sort of like a candlelit meal at home, something that's not expensive, but just something that says, we've achieved some success here, and we're making progress, and the debts are being reduced. And as you roll down, you will first of all end up with fewer red letters, fewer unpleasant calls or emails. What you must do is make sure that when the debts are repaid, you stop the relationship with that company, because as soon as you've paid the debt off, even if they were chasing and threatening you, the next thing they're doing is saying, have some more money. And so you just read through, go onto the internet, check our website, and use the snowball method to help you get out of debt. I hope it's clear in the manual. I hope it's clear with what we've got on the website. So how can you reduce your expenses? It's okay me saying, as I just did, find a little bit extra, but look through your savings. Remember I said to you earlier on that to get out of debt, you mustn't stop giving and you mustn't stop saving. Here's why. Some people get into debt. Here's an example. Somebody gets into debt because a household appliance is broken down. There's children, or for whatever reason, you go and spend the 200, 300 or 400, and you do it on a card, fully intending to pay it off. And then you suddenly find out that, haven't quite got the money to pay it off. And so we end up sort of like being a victim of an unfortunate circumstance. The fact is that circumstance could reoccur. And the reason why I want you to start saving £5 a month, £10 a month, 50, find what you can save, is because I want you to create a reserve so that when the next unexpected, which incidentally is to be expected, expenditure arises, you don't have to default to debt again. Oh, and the reason why it's important to keep on giving, sometimes people say, oh, I'll start giving when I've got out of debt. They never do. They never do. It is important to give, and we're going to look at giving very shortly. Start where you can to build up a 1 to 3 or 6 month cushion, reserve, and also when it comes to more costly expenses, make sure that you save for them rather than defaulting to debt. Take the silly example I gave you of my coffee machine. I was prepared to wait and wait. Did I have the money? Yes. But did I think it was right to spend that amount of money on a coffee machine? No, I didn't. And so, depending on your circumstances, here are some principles. As you're listening to me, remember I said to you, you're not obligated to believe anything I say, but everything I say is my interpretation of what I see in the Bible. What is yours? Apply biblical principles, pray, seek good advice, outwork your plans. Can you increase your income? Perhaps part-time work. Do you perhaps need to get a new job? Do you have something to sell? Remember I said to you that you're either going to increase income, reduce expenses, or sell something. Why is it that there are all these storage companies that are setting up everywhere? Because we've created so much stuff. We now need to go and pay to store all this stuff. And so there are some ideas on how to increase your income. Maybe you need to go to one of the debt agencies I've talked about. There's Christians Against Poverty. There are, who incidentally don't help people who have got business debts, so far as I'm aware. There's the Money Charity, just great, lovely people who are there with some very experienced, wise counsellors who perhaps could help. So is there a CAP centre near you? Do you need somebody that you know that could help be a buddy? Because if you're in difficulty, then have other people around to help you and encourage you. Well, we're now into extra time, so remember, you've seen some coffee shop films. Parents, remember we talked about teaching the children, and I talked to you about these 2 books that we have. They're just great ways. Here's what you could do. We used to have a money box called the ABC Money Box, and people would put their children would put their money in, giving, saving, spending. Get a shoebox, okay? Have an afternoon, with one weekend with the children. Get yourself something like a shoebox. Put a couple of dividers down, put some holes in the top, and then get the children to mark on the side of the box, give, save, spend. Have them earn their pocket money. Because, you know, they might be young today, but tomorrow they could be earning. And let's teach them that, you know, money comes as a result of work. So don't just give them money, make them tidy their rooms. Yeah, that would be good. Have them take the bins outside, or just find something that they can do. I would never let my children clean the car, because I used to think that, you know, if my children clean the car, the sponge will go onto the floor and then I'll get grit. So I didn't do that. And then let's just say they have £1. So they have perhaps 10 pence for giving, 20 pence for saving, and look, you've got 70 pence to save and to spend. So just make something of it. But you know what? You're creating a discipline, and anyway, that's just an idea. Have a look on our website, because we still have some of those money boxes, but at the time of the recording, they weren't on the website, and we might put them up there. But if you're really keen, then send me an email, and they're only about £5 or £6. They're lovely things for the kids, and people usually like them. And then there's some scripture memory verses for next time. And you know, that is, apart from my encouragement, you are reading Bought. We'd love you to keep reading Bought and to get through the end. Questions for your leader will be coming up in about 10 seconds, because this has been the module in the Navigating Your Finances way on being free to serve him. Next time, we're going to talk together, and we're going to go on the journey of how to grow in generosity. I will look forward to seeing you. Now over to your group leader. Enjoy.